Operant conditioning. Mark is a student in Miss Ferguson's geography class. This is what happens to Mark during the first week of October. Monday. Miss Ferguson asks the class to locate Colombia on the globe. Mark knows where Colombia is, and he sits smiling, with his hands on his desk, hoping that Miss Ferguson will call on him. Instead, she calls on another student. Tuesday. Miss Ferguson asks the class where Colombia got its name. Mark knows that Colombia is named after Christopher Columbus, so he raises his hand a few inches. Miss Ferguson calls on another student. Wednesday. Miss Ferguson asks the class why people in Colombia speak Spanish rather than English or French. Mark knows that Colombians speak Spanish because the country's early settlers came from Spain. He raises his hand high in the air. Miss Ferguson calls on another student. Thursday. Miss Ferguson asks the class why Colombia grows coffee but Canada does not. Mark knows that coffee can only be grown in certain climates. He raises his hand high and waves it wildly back and forth. Miss Ferguson calls on him. Friday. Whenever Miss Ferguson asks a question that Mark can answer, Mark raises his hand high and waves it wildly. Notice how several of Mark's behaviors in geography class, such as sitting quietly, smiling, and raising his hand politely, bring no results. But waving his hand wildly does bring Mark the result that he wants, his teacher's attention. The response that has attracted Miss Ferguson's attention continues. Other responses disappear. The change in Mark's behavior illustrates operant conditioning, a form of learning described by many behaviorists, and most notably by Skinner. The basic principles of operant conditioning are quite simple. When behaviors are followed by desirable consequences, they tend to increase in frequency. However, when behaviors don't produce results, they typically decrease, and may even disappear altogether. There are two types of reinforcement which will increase the frequency of a behavior: positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. It is important to remember that Skinner was a scientist and did not think of positive as being good and negative as bad. Just like positive numbers are not good and negative numbers are not bad. Think of the positive and negative symbols as math signs, where the plus sign means adding, and the minus sign means taking away. When we positively reinforce a behavior, we add something desirable, such as praise, a favorite food, or a preferred activity. For example, a girl is praised for writing an assignment in cursive. She begins to write other assignments in cursive as well. Or a student gets his lunch money by bullying a girl into surrendering hers. He begins bullying his classmates more frequently. When a behavior is negatively reinforced, something undesirable is taken away or avoided, such as not having to complete homework. Other examples include a student who no longer has to worry about a research paper he has completed several days before the due date. He begins to do his assignments ahead of time whenever possible. Or a student escapes the principal's wrath by lying about her role in a recent incident of school vandalism. She begins lying to school faculty whenever she finds herself in an uncomfortable situation. Daydreaming to avoid a boring lecture is also an example of negative reinforcement. Using reinforcement effectively requires two conditions. First, the learner must make a response, that is, the learner must do something. Second, the reinforcer should be contingent on the learner's response. That is, it should occur when, and only when, the desired response has occurred. Only praising students when they behave appropriately is making reinforcement contingent on desired behavior. In contrast, the teacher who laughs at the antics of a chronically misbehaving student is providing reinforcement even when an acceptable response hasn't occurred. Not surprisingly, there are also two forms of punishment. The frequency of a behavior can be decreased by using positive punishment or negative punishment, although those terms are not often used by teachers. When a behavior is positively punished, something undesirable is added, such as writing lines or being spanked. Other examples include a student who is scolded for taunting other students. She taunts others less frequently after that. Or a student is ridiculed by classmates for asking a, quote, stupid, unquote, question during a lecture. He stops asking questions in class. Positive punishment is also known as presentation punishment. If you have noticed the pattern, you have likely figured out that negative punishment occurs when something desirable is taken away, such as the loss of a privilege, a fine, or being grounded when certain pleasurable outside activities are missed. Other examples include a student being removed from the softball team for a week for showing poor sportsmanship. She rarely shows poor sportsmanship after that. Or a student losing points on a test for answering a question in a creative way. He takes fewer risks on future tests. Negative punishment is also known as removal punishment. It is important to remember that whether something is desirable or undesirable varies depending on the person. If you don't like playing video games, they won't be an effective reinforcement or punishment. Consequences are far more effective when they are tailored to individual students than when the same are used for everyone. Now it is time to apply what you have learned again. Which types of operant conditioning are being implemented in this scenario? The greatest application of operant conditioning has been to classroom management, where it is frequently used to increase appropriate behavior and decrease inappropriate behavior. ClassDojo is a web-based application that utilizes the principles of operant conditioning. Teachers identify the behaviors they wish to reward and those they wish to discourage. Students are assigned monster avatars and teachers can award points or demerits. Teachers often provide additional rewards for acquiring a set amount of points. Give praise about specific behaviors rather than general areas of performance. For example, if a student has just completed an excellent oral book report, a teacher might say, "Nice job, Monica. You made the book sound so interesting. I certainly want to read it now and I suspect that many of your classmates do as well." Or as kindergarteners are cleaning up after a class art project, a teacher might say, "I like how everyone is remembering to pick up the scraps of paper around their desks." Review your class list occasionally to make sure that all students are receiving some reinforcement. Since not everyone likes the same things, let students suggest their own reinforcers or choose from a menu. Operant conditioning is different from classical conditioning in two important ways. Classical conditioning results from the pairing of two stimuli, the unconditioned stimulus that initially elicits a response, and a previously neutral stimulus that begins to elicit the same or similar response. In contrast, operant conditioning occurs when a response is followed by a reinforcer. In classical conditioning, the response is involuntary. In operant conditioning, the response is usually a voluntary one. The learner can control whether or not it occurs. In our case study, James is willingly behaving in these ways. No particular stimulus is forcing him to do so.